A lot of Eastern European humor was floating around at that point.
Regina is sort of not what you call a booming area anymore. Is it sort of?
It went through hell. Right. It went through hell. Started in '82 when Grant Devine got elected, and there was sort of always a rivalry between Regina and Saskatoon because Regina had the government. So when the NDP were in, they tended to put, like any industries that they brought in, they tended to put in Saskatoon, the high-tech stuff. And then when Devine came in, it was basically a rural vote. So he basically said, fuck the cities. And then he started cutting down the government. Well, 80% of Regina's economy was government. And people could just see the writing on the wall, and they just started leaving in droves. There was it was in the Globe. The out-migration at the time that we were deciding to leave was like 12,000 a year.
Yeah.
And
so, you came over from England, and I believe 1965.
Yeah.
You came to Vancouver. Were you here long enough to get an impression of what was happening theatrically? What your impressions were of what was happening in theater?
Well, not really. How can I put it? What we were interested in, that's my late wife Sue and I, was children's theater at that point, just purely children's theater. And when I went off to theater school 4 years before, Joy Coghill, who was then running Holiday Theatre, sort of said, if you can study with Brian Way and do some work with Brian Way, then come back and we'll look at turning Holiday Theatre over to you, or words to that effect. I mean, that was pretty heady stuff for a 21-year-old heading off to theatre school. And so I went to theatre school. I worked for Brian for 2 years, and then my mother died. So we had a fairly big decision to make about whether to come back for the funeral or just emigrate. And I was fairly mixed about it, because there was some interest from the Royal Shakespeare Company, and there were other theaters that I kind of was interested in. On the other hand, I was a Canadian, and there was virtually no professional theater in Canada at the time. And we had this kind of messianic feeling about the kind of children's theater that Brian was doing. So I guess within the space of about 48 hours, we made the decision to come back. Or at least I made a decision to come back, and Sue decided to come with me. And Brian gave us all his plays. So we came back in 64, I think, 64, 65. And I went to see Joy, and Joy, things obviously in 4 years had changed. But what she wanted us to do was to go and talk to the school boards in Vancouver and see if what we had to offer was something they wanted to do. And what we were doing, or what we wanted to do, what we had been doing with Brian, was a play for kindergarten to grade 3, another play for kindergarten for grade 4 to 6, play for, I guess, what we would call junior high school, 7, 8, and 9, and then another play for grade 10, 11, and 12. And there was no problem with the young stuff. They thought it was a really good idea. The high school shows, however, were 2 hours long. And there was massive resistance from the people we talked to at the school board about that kind of block of time, and couldn't we do 1 hour one week and 1 hour the next week, and compromise. Well, when you're 25 and know everything, there is no compromise. And we were kind of disappointed at the kind of resistance to it. So what happened? So at that point, I was offered a job in Edmonton by my very first teacher, Betty Anderson, who had worked for Parks and Recreation in Edmonton, to come and be a drama director in the city of Edmonton. And so we said, to hell with Vancouver, we were going to go off to Edmonton and start the theater there. And that's what happened. In '65, we went to Edmonton. I became drama director of Parks and Recreation, and was basically in charge of doing creative drama classes and training people for creative drama classes, and putting on there was a thing called Playground Players, a group of 6 people who would go from playground to playground doing improvised stuff with the kids. We were very into that kind of audience participation, educational, pushing the boundaries of art with kids, not just doing playmaking, but also doing art and dance and that kind of stuff. The problem we ran into in Edmonton was twofold. One, the city had a bylaw that said 2 people from the same family could not work for the city at the same time, which effectively excluded Sue from working, even as a teacher, and she was a great teacher. The other problem was that Joe Schachter was beginning to make noises about starting the Citadel Theatre. And that was sucking all the energy out of any kind of starting any kind of children's theatre, because there was a children's theatre there on a semi-professional level. It was operating in a theatre. We wanted to operate in schools. What we wanted to do was bring theatre to where the kids were, rather than bringing kids to where the theatre happened. And that's a whole other discussion in terms of form. And we spent a really frustrating year there. We could just not get anything going. But in the meantime, while all this is a very, a very long answer to a very short question. In the meantime, we had been sort of proselytizing this kind of children's theatre across the country. We were going to Dominion Drama Festivals. We were doing workshops in creative drama all over the country. And one of the places that we ended up doing a fairly major workshop was in Regina and Saskatchewan. So, the summer of '65, Sue went off to Charlottetown to do workshops. I was left alone in Edmonton, and I guess the 2 of us started thinking, because we wrote these letters which crossed, and they both said we got to get out. We've got to go back to England because this is getting ridiculous. So at that point, I wrote a letter to everybody I knew, coast to coast, and said, okay, this is what we want to do. This is the way we want to do it. We do not want to compromise it in any way. And if we can't get an offer to do it somewhere, we're going back to England. And because I still had landed status there. And we got some interesting replies from various places, but the big one was a phone call from Rena Howard, who was in Regina and head of the Regina Children's Theatre at that point, and said, come and talk to the Saskatchewan Arts Board. I flew in, I made a pitch. By the end of the summer, we were on our way to Saskatchewan. I still have a photograph of Sue at Edmonton Airport, sort of coming off the plane, because this was all done while she was away, and the name Globe was thought up like overnight, and you know, of her standing in front of the airport, sort of, at last, we're there.
Before we go to Regina,
sure.
Is there anything? I'm obviously looking at all the areas. I mean, you were only in Edmonton for a short while,
right?
So then you can, you mentioned Joe Schachter, you mentioned the beginning of the Citadel. So you were there actually as that was beginning to happen, but obviously you weren't directly involved. But did you have any sense of what was going on at that point?
Well, not really. I mean, to be frank with you, we were both pretty self-centered, and we both knew the way theater ought to happen, and nobody else did, and still feel that way from time to time. And we were there the first year of the Citadel. I think I only saw one show. but it was not very good, at least from our point of view. I can't remember the name of the first artistic director, but I mean, it was one of those situations where they were really trying to do stuff on the cheap, and you know, he would come in and block out of the book and then go away, and the stage manager would deal with the actors, and then the show would go up a week later. But you know, Joe just persisted and persisted, and the theater grew and grew until it is what it is now. And there were a lot of really interesting people who came out of there. Young man named Phil Silver, who's now designing all over the country. But at that point, we had no interest in, except tangentially, we had no interest in adult theater. I did some work with the university, sort of the professional within a student production. I think Sue did a couple. But we were really on the edges of that, because all we were interested in at that point was educational theater and theater for young people.
Did you cross paths with Tom Peacock during that?
Oh yeah, I knew Tommy fairly well. Again, only through the university. Well, both Tommy and Gordon.
Mm-hmm. Could you describe Tom Peacock to me? Like, I'm going to be speaking to him.
Oh.
So.
I don't know how to describe Tom to you. The one show I was in was directed by him, and he's a marvelous teacher. He's just a terrific teacher, and one of those people, I think, who, I don't know whether he made a choice or not to take the academic route or to become a professional. I mean, Rex Deverell, who was my playwright in residence for years, wrote a play about a character named Aggie who always wanted to be an actress, but there was no theater. And I think that was the description of, you know, a lot of people of Tommy's generation, and of mine too, or, you know, a little older than me, who really wanted to be actors, but there was no theater. So what they had to do was go to Toronto, and a lot of them did. And that was one of the things that we, you know, very strongly stood for all the years that we were in Regina, and I mean even in Edmonton, and I mean the idea that an artist should be able to practice their art where they live, kind of anachronistic in this day and age, but I still believe that you shouldn't have to go to Toronto to make a living. That you ought, if you come from a place, you ought to be able to do what you do where you do it, and the country ought to support that.
Was it a semi-professional company that was, or was there that you worked with Tom Peacock?
No, it was at the university. It was a student production, and I was brought in as sort of guest professional. It was Three Sisters, and the part he offered me was Solioni, and I said to him, I can play Solioni with one hand tied behind my back. I don't want to play that part. The part I want to play is Kuligan, the school teacher, which was way out of anything that I'd ever played, and it was a problem I wanted to solve, and I solved it. I felt very happy about that, so I owe him a lot for that.
Okay, well, although you weren't there, I was going to throw a few people out that were in Saskatchewan, I guess, prior to you.
Okay.
And, you know, whatever you can give us is fine. I know that you knew Florence James, I believe.
Oh, very well. Yeah, she, in fact, during her latter years after she left the Arts Board, she worked for us.
How would you describe, I mean, it's a big question, but, you know, what did she mean to theater in Saskatchewan?
Oh, what did she mean to theater? She was everything. I don't know if you know Florence's history at all, but she and her husband, Burton, started the Seattle Repertory Theater way back. An old lefty from way back. They did incredible things in Seattle. They started the first Negro company ever. I mean, we're talking back in the 20s and 30s now. And they had a lot of money out of the WPA, what was it called? The Workers' Progress Administration. Anyway, both Sue and I were really interested in, well, okay, let's back up. Brian was a devoted open stage person. Now that didn't necessarily mean in the round. what it meant was it could be three-sided, it could be four-sided, it could be a circle, it could be anything but proscenium, and anything but something where you can hide behind the scenery. And while I worked for him, we went to Stoke-on-Trent, saw Peter Cheeseman's theatre in the Round. And Chichester had just opened while we were there, so that there was all this experimentation going on in terms of form in England. So when we got here, of course, the plays that we did were of necessity, because they were written by Brian, done that way. So the most, in the early years, the thing we would do was draw a 12-foot circle on the floor and then put gangways for entrances and exits. And the kids would sit right on the floor, and then the actors would come in and play within that 12-foot circle. Very primitive. You know, at that point I was reading an awful lot of books about the history of form in theater, and I mean, we were getting back to a pre-Italian opera kind of very basic kind of storytelling theater. The Shakespeare stuff that we did, the kids were on chairs, because obviously you're not going to ask girls in skirts to sit on the floor. I mean, it was, you know, but again, it was usually three-sided with an open backside, which it didn't have any scenic elements on it at all. I mean, usually what we would do is sit up in front of the school stage. The stage would be our dressing room, and then we would just use that curtain or the lip of the stage as a backdrop. When we got into doing some of Brian's non-Shakespearean stuff, he wrote a number of plays. One about Elizabeth Fry, called Angel of the Prisons, I think. We would actually close it up and make a square, and the actors would act in there. The thing I found exciting about working that way was it was more natural. You didn't have two people standing talking to each other like this and pretending to be in. They could actually stand face to face. Or if you had people, well, we didn't ever have people sit down because we had no rake on the seats. Everybody was sitting level. But later on, when we got into the main stage stuff, you know, and the seats were raked up, you could actually have people sitting around a table like they really do in real life, talking to each other. And we played around with that for a long time. It also forced actors to improve their diction, because at any time you had 50% of the audience behind your back. You had to learn to act with your whole body and make your back as expressive as your front, which for a lot of actors was kind of weird. And then when we started the adult company, well, I mean, early on we still toured the adult company, but when we eventually got into a theater, we played with shape a lot. We did traverse, which is the audience is sitting on either side of a long room, and the actors would, you know, you had a stage here and a stage in the middle and a stage. One play we did in a triangle. We had these movable risers at the Saskatchewan Centre of the Arts so we could play. And then when we moved out of there into a regular theater, or at least into a building of our own, we had to make a decision architecturally, because it had pillars. And we had to make a decision about whether to go three-sided or four-sided, and Sue and I talked about it, and we said, well, three-sided is a cop-out. I mean, either we believe in this or we don't believe in this. So we went fully in the round. The school tour always was open stage, always. It never went proscenium. Or it never went to any kind of scenic. Later on, as we got some money, we tried to introduce some scenic elements, but essentially it boiled down to the absolute basics, for me, of theater. Story, actor, costume, and things like boxes. You know, that the audience could decide, you know, if you sat on it, it was a chair. If you stood on it, it was a battlement. The idea was that, well, Brian used to have a phrase which I use, which is a kid who said to him, the scenery that you thinks up in your head is better than the scenery that they makes for you. only he does it in a Cockney accent, and that's always been a kind of touchstone of my life. And then suddenly you're doing plays, you know, that you normally couldn't think of because you can't afford the scenery. So, but it was a steady progression through the school tour, and I had hoped over the years that we might have some kind of influence on the Canadian theatre scene. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. I think Stratford tried, maybe they still do, but at a certain point, but it was like in the 80s, they turned one of their small theaters into a theater in the Round, and but the open stage never took off in Canada, partly because people were stuck with buildings, partly because they were pandering to an already established taste in the audience and was afraid to try anything experimental, and partly because we lived in Regina. For years, nobody paid any attention to what we were doing because, and in the later years they still didn't pay any attention to what we were doing because there was this somehow Toronto-centric, Vancouver-centric feeling that if something was happening in a small town like that, it couldn't be that important, which was really disappointing. But you know, now that I'm freelancing and end up on a proscenium stage, I just don't know why they keep going, and with this form, it's so phony, it's so awful, you know.
How did you find the community when you, in terms of the schools, and was there really a bit large excitement for you, or was there some convincing about what you were doing?
Well, there was a lot of convincing to be done. In our, I mean, as I said, you can't want what you don't know. And when we first got there, there were very few bookings for what we had to offer. So we talked the Arts Board into an experiment where buy one show, get one free kind of thing. And I did a lot of driving around talking to school superintendents and to drama teachers. And the people who gave us the greatest reception were the schools that were run by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church in Saskatchewan was a pretty radical place. And one of the people who did an awful lot for us was a lay monk in a Benedictine abbey called Father Thomas Gerwing. And we used to play Munster on a regular basis. And then there were schools run by nuns in the area, and they picked up on it. And a lot of the first experience that teachers got of what we did was because of their encouragement. They were really on the cutting edge of education in Saskatchewan for a long time. And so that's what we did. We traveled around the province playing, you know, one show here, one show there. And at the end of the first year, we sent out forms to all the schools sort of saying, okay, if you have the subsidy, how many performances do you want? If we have to go 100% on our own, how many performances do you want? And of course, the subsidy pile was like this, and the other pile was like this. And I finally went to the Arts Board and had a meeting with them, and I said, look, that's what we can do with subsidy. That's what we can do without subsidy. And they gave me subsidy. It's a lot. I'm making it sound a lot easier than it was. There was an awful lot of heartache. I mean, the first company, oh boy, we started in September, October of '66, and by November we were out of money. And we had a lot of talking to do, both with the Arts Board and with continuing education and the recreation people, and then we started again in January. And by, I think it was on my birthday actually, we ran out of money in swift current. All the checks bounced, and we folded our tent and came back to Regina. And you know, and then there was the meeting with the Arts Board, and then we applied to the Canada Council. And in fact, we got a Canada Council grant. I think we might have been the only company in Canada that ever got a Canada Council grant in its first year. because usually you had to kind of be there. But there was a lot of political pressure on the Arts Board not to give us money through the Premier, because I had a beard, my hair was kind of long and stuff. And I remember distinctly sitting in the office of the Executive Director of the Saskatchewan Arts Board, I don't know if I should say this, George Shaw, and the Canada Council was taking the point of view that if the provincial government wouldn't subsidize us, why should the federal government? And we were sitting talking about how to explain to the Canada Council the situation, and this phone rang. Now, it didn't go ding-dong like the Saskatchewan Arts Board phones. It went ring, and George opened his bottom drawer, pulled out the telephone. This was the untapped line. This was the line that was a secure line for him. And he spoke to the Canada Council and explained that the Saskatchewan Arts Board, it wasn't that the Saskatchewan Arts Board didn't want to continue to subsidize the Globe Theatre. The Saskatchewan Arts Board was unable to continue to subsidize the Globe Theatre in that fiscal year, and bang, we got a Canada Council grant. It was interesting political times.
Did you feel, I guess, through these times that it was going to end, or did you just figure you'd find the money and it would continue?
There were times where we figured we were beating our heads against a stone wall, and there were other times where I think by the time the Canada Council came in, and we had that level of subsidy, and the school thing was growing, and our reputation was growing, that I don't think we ever really felt secure. I mean, we lived there 5 years renting because we didn't think we'd be there that long, and at the end of 5 years, we bought a house because it looked like we were going to stay. And I think the only time we ever really felt like that we could actually think about what we were doing rather than how to keep the thing going was around 72 through 77. There was a lot of money in the system, and we were getting a pretty good share of it, and and you suddenly felt that you could accomplish something, you could actually grow. But no, there was always this feeling that it was a temporary thing. That we were young, we were energetic, we were idealists, and we just kept on pushing.
Could you talk about the forming of the first company, like the choices you made in terms of who you chose and how?
Oh, okay. You mean the very first year?
Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, the first company, there was obviously Sue and me. I directed and acted, and general managed, and booked. Sue acted and designed the wardrobe, and helped. I mean, in this first year, and we weren't an equity company yet. Everybody did everything. I mean, there were only 6 of us, and we built everything, we painted everything, we designed everything. The year that we were in Edmonton, we had this happy band of players called the Playground Players, and sat around with a number of them dreaming about this theater we were going to start. One of them was Miriam Newhouse, so she was an obvious choice. And at that point, the company was going to be 3 men, 3 women, because that's the place we were doing. So that was Sue and Miriam. And then the third person was Patty Campbell, who was also part of Playground Players. And Patty has gone on to be a playwright. Now it came to the guys. And we auditioned people in Regina, and lo and behold, found these 2 wonderful people. One was Russ Waller, who at that point, now I honestly don't know, he seemed very old to me. I was, 26, so he had to be at least in his mid-40s. And he was an interesting guy. I'm not exactly sure of his history, but he was the first graduate from the University of Regina in his 40s. Decided to go back to school and get a degree, and I think went on to teach at Queen's And the other was a local actor, young man named Bill Higley, who's still in Regina and still working, I think. And that was that first company. Then at Christmas time of that year, I ended up with a major abscess tooth. And I had a lip that was down to here and I couldn't act, obviously. So then we brought in Doug Risk, who then went on to found Alberta Theatre Projects and latterly has been at the New Bastion Theatre, which unfortunately has just bit the biscuit. And that was the second half. And then the third company, and I'm going to have to apologize because I can't remember all those people. But I think it was at that point that we went equity, because we sort of ended up with three companies. And the reason, there was such a changeover is it really was a grind. I mean, it really was a grind, because what we would do, is we would have a certain number of bookings when we left Regina, and we'd get in the car and we would drive, and we would go from school to school, and after school I'd go back to the motel and I'd call the Arts Board offices where we were sharing offices and find out if any more bookings had come in, and if that happened to be, like a day's drive away, then we would just get in the car and drive. And we had to come back to Regina every weekend. The reason for that was that we had no vehicle. So what we did was make use of, and again, this is really politically incorrect, the Saskatchewan Arts Board vehicles. I mean, this is the kind of faith, and this is the kind of thing that the Saskatchewan Arts Board did in those days. They used to get the cars out of the Central Vehicle Agency, and Sunday night, I would go down and pretend to be one of their staffers, and I would get out a station wagon. And then we would load the station wagon and we would drive Monday through Friday, and we would come back to Regina on Friday night, and the Arts Board then took the car and went out to do the Arts Board business. And I think within the first 3 or 4 months we had totally exhausted their vehicle budget. And actually the Canada Council grant bought us a Volkswagen van, which was our first vehicle. But it was tiring. You'd get up at 7 in the morning and drive to the school, and you'd be set up by 8:30, and you'd do your shows, and then sometimes you would have to pack up and go to a second school in the afternoon, do the show, and then we would drive 2-3 hours to the next town and crash and get up the next morning. And it really took its toll on people, and as much as they loved doing it, they didn't have, there were other things to do in life besides sit in crappy motels and eat Campbell's soup out of over a hot plate. So, but it was good times.
Do you have, I know you've given a pretty good description of what it was like. Do you have any sort of stories, humorous or otherwise, that sort of also reflect on that touring challenge? That can be repeated?
Yeah, that can be repeated. There's a lot that can't be repeated. No, I mean, the number of times we drove through blizzards to get to schools, only to discover the schools weren't open. The time, anybody who's lived in Saskatchewan will know this kind of thing. We were staying in Saskatoon, and I can't remember, I think it was Delisle. We were going to, it was about a half-hour, 40-minute drive. So we get to the school at 8 o'clock. Nobody there. Can't figure this out because the janitor's always there, the teachers are always there, school starts at 9. We didn't know what to do, so we then drove to the local coffee shop to have breakfast. And it's like 8:15, and I'm looking over at the school, and there's nobody, no cars, no nothing. So I said to the waitress, I said, why is there nobody at the school? And she said, well, the school's on slow time and the town's on fast time. Now, for those who know Saskatchewan, Uh, the Central Time Zone and the Rocky Mountain Time Zone come kind of right down past Saskatoon. And I don't know if they've changed it, but in those days, the community had local option. You could either be on fast time, which would be Regina, which was on Central Time, or you could be on slow time, which was Alberta time. And we always, when we had our booking forms, within the first year, you would put starting time, and then they would have to tick off MST/CST because we didn't know for the longest time, and you'd sometimes. So what happened was that the town was on Central Standard Time, the school was on Mountain Standard Time. And at 9 o'clock we showed up at the school, and the janitor was there because it was 8 o'clock at the school. And that was a hard one for actors to get used to. It was one of the unique things about Saskatchewan that I loved that actors from the East could not figure out. And most of our actors were from the East. The other thing, and this is really not necessarily an amusing story, but you could always tell if an actor was going to come back. The first thing, you see, most of the actors in the early years were from Toronto. I mean, that's where the actors went to live. There were no professional actors to speak of living in Regina or Saskatoon at the time. I seldom came out to Vancouver because Vancouver people don't like the prairies. And you could always tell if an actor was going to fit, because the first thing that would happen was culture shock. Okay, they were in a small town. Regina was what, maybe 120, 125,000 people at the time. Stores were closed on Monday because the city fathers figured that if other people got a 2-day weekend, retailers should get a 2-day weekend. So if you knew you had to do your shopping, your grocery shopping on a Saturday, that was going to get you through to Tuesday because the Safeway would be closed. That was a bit of a shock. The flatness was a bit of a shock. Now, soon I really got off on the beauty of that landscape, which is not at all flat. It's flat to a British Columbian, it's flat to an Ontarian. But the subtle changes of that landscape and the modulations that you would get from deepest, darkest January, I mean, there is no place in the world that spring is such an exciting thing that when you've been in a deep freeze from November. The actors that got off on that found that exciting, that could relate to that physical environment, who also understood, and this is going to sound weird, but who also understood how small you felt in the face of that kind of weather. You know, that there was, you were always aware through the school tour of just how dangerous the weather could be. And just what a small thing a human being was sitting in a car going up number 11 highway when the snow was blowing. Those people who hated that were not going to last. Those people who found that viscerally exciting were the people who kept coming back to the Globe year after year after year. And I think, one of the things that we never did that we really wanted to do was have some kind of permanent company to have actors come to Regina and live, and they wouldn't do it. I mean, a great actor who worked for us for a long time, Dave McCulley, one day as he was leaving, just gave me a big kiss and said, I love this place, I love you guys, and if you were in Toronto, I'd be with you the whole time, but I can't live in Regina that long. And over the period of time, we had what we would call our floating permanent company. A pool of actors who had done the school tour. I mean, Jim Timmons worked with us from '67 through to the day I left the Globe. Not every year, sometimes every 2 years. And there was this really interesting group of actors who kept floating in and floating out of the theater. And there were times when, particularly in the 80s, when I would sit down and say, now you all know each other, because they'd all worked. And they didn't know each other because they were all there at different years. but they'd all had the same experience. And very, very seldom did we ever use anybody on the main stage that hadn't gone through that school tour experience, because the philosophies of the company and the casting decisions in the company were so related to not typecasting, but the kind of breadth of casting that you have to do on a school tour. And I think there was a very, very special group of people over the years. And one of the things I find interesting is that some of them never worked regularly in their hometowns, but for some reason, I don't know why. But I would have them back in a minute. I mean, others have gone on to star at Stratford. I mean, Lucy Peacock and Goldie Semple and people like that, have obviously made a place for themselves. But there was this incredible group of actors who seemed to do their best work at the Globe for some reason. And I'd work with them again in a minute.
Your first location in Regina was at the Saskatchewan Arts. What was it called?
Well, there was a building that was known as Government House, and it used to be the Lieutenant Governor's residence. And the CCF in those days kind of figured this was a uppity thing to have happen in the People's Province, so they moved him out and turned it into offices, and those were the Arts Board offices. So we actually rehearsed in the ballroom with this big chandeliers coming down, and that was our first rehearsal hall. We made the sets in the basement, and they gave us a desk and a phone. And the Arts Board offices were there for years, and also continuing education. And what's strange to say now is that the Lieutenant Governor is back living in Government House. I think the NDP did that. I can't remember, but it's odd how things change. We need to have a really. You can't have them living at the Hotel Saskatchewan forever. But no, it was Government House, stuck sort of on the west end of town near the RCMP, in that sort of Dewdney land that. I don't know if you know about Dewdney, who sort of bought up all this land because he was trying to get Regina, the capital. There was a big fuss over where it was going to be the capital, and he finally won. And the CPR basically said, "Screw you," and stuck their station 3 miles away into what is now downtown Regina. And Dewdney was stuck with all this land that he was trying to make a fortune on. So they built government. So the feds built Government House there, you see, to sort of kind of pay him back, and that's where the RCMP training depot is located, is on the Dewdney lands. So that was our first place.
And how did you get along with the